This is Rock and Roll English. Real people, real English. Here's your host, Martin Johnston.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Rock and Roll English. Episode number... should have checked that before, shouldn't I? Now, today, sadly I couldn't get anyone of my regular people on the podcast this week, but don't worry, they are all coming. I've got lots planned over Easter, lots of recording planned. However, it's not just going to be me talking, because I have lots of people for you to listen to, okay? Because I'm going to tell you a story, an audio story, let's say, and I've just kind of listened back to this podcast and quite proud of this. And if you get to the very end, I think it will explain why Rock and Roll English was started, okay? But anyway, this is a story about a radical political movement, about chaos, creativity, and some of the greatest music ever made in Britain. And a frontman, a musician who became a legend and sadly then took his own life. A nightclub that went from being completely empty to iconic, and a musical legend who couldn't play an instrument and couldn't even sing. And also me, your host, Martin, directly involved with one of the people in this story, okay? So this story is kind of about the music from Manchester, known as Manchester music, and it's quite close to my heart. It always has been, but recently an important member of the Manchester music scene sadly passed away, so I've kind of got back into it and kind of remembered how beautiful some of the stories are, and also how important one person from this story is in my life. So we are going to listen to lots of small interviews of many people, okay? We are not going to do any transcription exercises, in case you were wondering. I was tempted to do that, but I thought let's just focus on the love of the story this time, okay? Because I want to transmit some British culture to you. Some British culture which you are maybe unlikely to have heard. Some things, yes. Some of the music I'm going to talk to you about is extremely famous, but some of it, no. And definitely some of the stories connected to this, I don't think you will know, or you may know one or two. So every story needs a main character, doesn't it? And the main character of this story is the man who couldn't play the instrument and couldn't sing, however, is an absolute legend in British music. His name is Tony Wilson, okay? I actually have a couple of pictures of him up in my house, okay? So we'll get into him a bit. We're going to hear lots of interviews from him, but just to tell you something about him, okay? Tony Wilson was very much into situationism, okay? Now, I don't really know what this is. I kind of had to look it up on ChatGPT, and having done so, actually quite explains quite a lot about the man Tony Wilson was. So situationism was a political movement apparently in the 50s and 60s, and the main idea is that life is fake and controlled by consumer culture, okay? So basically we just consume images, media, and we don't fully live life, we just consume it. Now think, this idea was floated in the 50s and 60s. Now, I don't think this could be any truer now in the social media age. But anyway, the basic idea is life has become a spectacle, something that we watch and not something we live, okay? So people that are into situationism like to disrupt normal life, okay? Shock people, create real experiences, situations, okay? So basically meaning they don't live by the rule book, okay? And that was Tony Wilson. So Tony Wilson went to a famous gig in Manchester by the Sex Pistols, you know, Johnny Rotten. And that gig is now known as the gig that changed the world. Apparently there were only like 40 people there, but many of the people there went on to either start a band or do something else in the music industry, like Tony Wilson, who clearly identified with the Sex Pistols for their punk attitude Obviously, the Sex Pistols were quite controversial at the time for their album The Queen is Dead. That was in like the 70s, so to speak against the royal family like that in the public domain was obviously, I mean, it even still would be now, but was a massive scandal back then. But again, takes the punk attitude, the don't live by the rule attitude. So Tony Wilson, after this gig, started his own record label, okay, called Factory Records. This is important, okay, as he obviously had an eye for good music, as you will hear here, where he talks about the credit he got for giving people their TV debut, okay, because Tony also worked for a TV channel, and he got a lot of credit for giving people their first time on TV, okay? But here he's saying something a bit different, where he's talking about not just the people, not just the bands he put on TV.
But to my real credit, only I know the 533 bands I didn't put on television. I was right about every single fucking one of them, including the Boomtown Rats. Fuck off.
So basically he's saying there, he gets credit for the bands he put on TV, but only he knows about the 500 and something bands which he didn't put on TV, which he said no to, including the Boomtown Rats. So let's just listen again, because we are still trying to hone your listening skills, aren't we?
But to my real credit, only I know the 533 bands I didn't put on television. I was right about every single fucking one of them, including the Boomtown Rats. Fuck off.
He obviously throws in some colourful language there, our Tony, doesn't he? Now, obviously, if you sign a good band, if you are a record label, we get them under contract, maybe to make 5 albums whilst they are under your contract, and then everyone gets rich. But as we know, Tony was a situationist, a punk. He didn't follow the rules. So he got, this is a true story, the only contract he had was a piece of paper which he signed in his own blood. We own nothing, musicians own everything. That was it. That was the contract. In fact, we can hear now one of the musicians on the record label, Factory Records, talking about Tony's attitude to this. See if you can understand what Tony's phrase was.
Tony used to say, look, if you don't like it, you know what you can do.
Yeah, his phrase was the freedom to fuck off.
So yes, Tony used to say, if you don't like it, you know what you can do. And the other said, yes, his phrase was, you have the freedom to F off.
Tony used to say, look, if you don't like it, you know what you can do.
Yeah, his phrase was the freedom to fuck off.
But what I find wonderful about this story is the musicians actually liked that. So basically they got a bunch of people together, all like-minded people. In fact, we can hear again one of the musicians, the same musician, talking about how he felt about it, about this contractual agreement of the freedom to F off.
So much more valuable than having it tied into a contract.
It's so much more valuable than being tied into a contract, which is crazy really, isn't it? Because these people had families to feed, and really, from one day to the other, their boss could have told them to F off. But these are situationists we're talking about, punks. And another example of this is one of the bands on the album called the Jurity Column, who I must admit I don't actually know. Their first album cover, so they've made the vinyl, the record, and the album was made from sandpaper. The idea being that if you put that record in with other records, the sandpaper would destroy the other records. Again, a situationist ideology of disturbing the status quo. However, apparently the sandpaper that they put it in actually broke their record. So people were buying this record in sandpaper, and then it would basically open and damage the actual record that they had bought, not the other ones. And that is not the only time where they had a problem with the cover for a record, as we will hear later. But anyway, moving on, the most successful band signed by Tony Wilson and Factory Records was Joy Division. Now, one of the more famous bands which you may have heard about. And here is Tony explaining why he signed them, because he had seen them at a band competition night, something like that. And here he is explaining why he signed Joy Division.
Every group I'd seen in that evening had been on stage because they wanted to be in rock and roll. They wanted to be in a band. They wanted to put records out. And this group were on stage because they had no fucking choice. It's if they're driven, they don't even want to be there. It's just we have to be here because this stuff wants to come out of us.
So basically saying that evening he saw lots of bands that wanted to be a successful band, but this band, Joy Division, just had something that they needed to get out of them. The music had to come out so he could really feel that passion.
Every group I'd seen in that evening had been on stage because they wanted to be in rock and roll. They wanted to be in a band. They wanted to put records out. And this group were on stage because they had no fucking choice. It's if they're driven, they don't even want to be there. It's just we have to be here because this stuff wants to come out of us.
Now, in England, we say basically a band is successful when they crack America. Okay, if a band is only famous in England, yes, they are successful, but when they crack America, when they are famous in America, that's when they're really famous. Now, Joy Division were due to go to America for their American tour to crack America, but very sadly, the lead singer Ian Curtis sadly took his own life just before his 24th birthday. There's actually a really good film about this called Control, if you are interested. And he took his own life because, well, obviously we don't know, but it seems there was kind of a problem with his wife. He was in love with another woman. And just after he had died, a song that they had made just before he died is called Love Will Tear Us Apart. If you do anything today, or you can even do it now, I don't care, stop this podcast, go to Spotify and listen to Love Will Tear Us Apart by Joy Division. You may have already heard it. It'll be one of those songs where you hear it and say, oh, that one. It's an absolute masterpiece. And that song came out just after he had died because they had recorded it just before. So that obviously was a very difficult time for the record label, for the band. So they went to America, I imagine, just to try and, get away from things. And when they were in America, they noticed in New York, there was this new kind of New York disco scene. Tony said it was just radically different. It was completely mind-blowing. So we said, this is what it's got to be like. So then when Joy Division came back, they reformed a new band called New Order, and were clearly influenced by this New York disco sound. And then they had a massive hit called Blue Monday. Again, a great song, and that will 100% be a song where you say, oh yes, I definitely know that song. And this song, Blue Monday, became the biggest selling disc at the time. However, again, there was a problem because Factory Records was an artistic record label. And again, the sleeve where you put the record in had to be beautiful. And they designed it like a 3.5-inch floppy disk. Remember those things? But the problem was the cover cost more money than the record. So every time they sold a record, they were losing money, because it cost more money to build the sleeve than the money they received from the record. They said it was because they didn't really expect anyone to buy it. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. However, here is one of the members of New Order talking about it, because you would think he would be really angry about this, because essentially he was losing money for everything that he had made. So let's hear what he said.
I think we actually kept very much to our punk ethics right the way through New Order. Our attitude was very punky, and Factories was as well, which was what was, great about it.
So that was Peter Hook from New Order saying that they kept that punk attitude all the way. The attitude of we make the rules. And he finishes it by saying that is what was great about it, because Factory had the same attitude. So he said we kept the punk attitude, Factory did as well, and that is what was great about it. Who cares about the money? He didn't say that part, but that's obviously reading between the lines.
I think we actually kept very much to our punk ethics right the way through New Order. Our attitude was very punky, and Factories was as well, which was what was, great about it.
Anyway, this new New York disco dance had arrived in England via Tony Wilson and Factory Records, New Order. So then they decided to open a nightclub called the Hacienda. Okay, again, very famous in Britain. And again, we have this situationism reference. Apparently in the book, it says something about the Hacienda must be built. A place where people don't just consume, but actually experience life differently. So they built this hacienda, this nightclub, to experience life differently. But again, there was a problem with the hacienda, especially in the early days. See if you can understand what the problem was from this quote from Tony Wilson. Be warned, this is very difficult, but we will listen again.
In the first year of the club, when we were losing like 50 grand a month, we were open 7 nights a week because we thought it was a public service. Oh, just stupid.
So he said in the first year of the club, when we were losing 50 grand a month, £50,000 a month, and this is mid 1980s. I mean, 50 grand a month is still a hell of a lot of money now, but it was even more money in the mid 1980s. But anyway, he said we were losing 50 grand a month as we thought it was a public service. So again, there's so much brilliance in that. They don't care about the money because they see it as their duty to be open to provide this space to the public. And guess what? Nobody was going there. But let's just listen again.
In the first year of the club, when we were losing like 50 grand a month, we were open 7 nights a week because we thought it was a public service. Oh, just stupid.
So, as no one was going there, they had to try and do things to try and create some kind of interest in the venue, this nightclub that they had opened. So they ran a Battle of the Bands competition where local groups would come and play and then people would vote for the best band. And this one evening, a band called the Happy Mondays, who will be very important to this story, went and played. Okay, they counted up the votes and
we was last. And when Tony announced it, we'd won it.
Now, you weren't expecting that. That was Sean Ryder from the Happy Mondays, okay? And he said, we was last, because he's from the north. They don't have the R sound. They don't say last like me. They say last. And he also said we was, which is grammatically incorrect, but is a very common thing to say in England. So he said, we was last. But when Tony announced it, we'd won. Notice that we had won.
We was last. And when Tony announced it, we'd won it.
Sorry, we had won it, he said. Now again, that is the great thing about Tony Wilson. He's like, I don't care what you think. I like this band. And he was right to, because they went on to become very successful. Now, the Happy Mondays, let's say, were a bunch of scallywags. That is a great term. So a scallywag is someone who isn't particularly well behaved, okay? Now, they were, let's say, very rock and roll in a way, didn't really follow the rules again, had the punk attitude. And there was one person in the band called Bez. Okay, now he is important to the story. He is important to the part of the story where I come into the story. Yes, me, Martin, which I will tell you about at the end. Just remember Bez from the Happy Mondays. And Bez, by the way, was the dancer. Okay, he didn't actually sing, again, kind of like Tony, but he would always be on stage with the Happy Mondays with some maracas. So, you know, the things that you shake that makes noise. So he was just dancing around playing the maracas, which I think even I might be able to do. So now they have the Hacienda, which isn't going very well, and then they have the Happy Mondays, which is finally going to bring some money to them. And something else then brought in money, that this house music from this New York disco finally arrived in England, and then the Summer of Love was born. Okay, we're talking like 1988 now, where the dance floor was getting full with all of this dance music. They also created a new policy at the Hacienda, and their door policy was this: no policy. Okay, because again, even when I started going out in the early 2000s, there was a strict door policy at every nightclub. You had to wear shoes. You weren't allowed to wear like Adidas trainers. You had to wear shoes and trousers, not even jeans. So again, they were going very much against what normal people did, and they created a no policy, door policy. So anyway, it was the summer of love. Now, house music normally means one thing, and that is drugs, okay, like ecstasy. And this was happening in the hacienda, okay? And then drugs normally leads to something else, which is gangs and violence and everything else. So then, after a few years, this happened. Listen to Tony Wilson, giving an interview at a press conference here, okay? And then try to understand what happened to the hacienda.
It is with the greatest reluctance that for the moment we are turning the lights out on what is, for us, a most important place. We are forced into taking this drastic action in order to protect our employees, our members, and all our clients.
So basically, they had to close the hacienda, which obviously was a shame because they had been spending 50 grand a month. No one was going there. It was finally making money. And after a few years, they had to close it. So again, Factory Records had no money again. So as they had no money, they needed a new successful album. So they sent their biggest band away to record an album. Remember, the biggest band being the Happy Mondays, who are the Scallywags. Okay. Now, an example of them being scallywags was that they were all addicted to heroin at the time, a quite serious drug. But apparently they found out in Barbados there was no heroin. Okay, so they decided to send them there because they thought no heroin. I don't even know if I'm saying that correctly. But anyway, hopefully it's not a word that you're going to need very much. So no heroin on the island in Barbados, so let's send them there. So they went to sunny Barbados. They were sitting on the beach, and then the scallywags, the Happy Mondays, like Bez, got talking to a few of the locals and apparently found out it was what Tony called crack central, okay? That apparently there was loads of crack cocaine in Barbados. So instead of recording music, the band were taking lots of crack cocaine and then causing mayhem. Apparently they were driving some of those like Jeep things and they were crashing them. Bez broke his arm. But here is Tony telling part of a story, okay? A story about Sean Ryder, who was the front man of the group. One other thing, he also mentions Eddie Grant. You may be familiar with him, an artist. I'm not sure if he's from Barbados, but basically the Happy Mondays were using his recording studio, okay? So let's hear Tony tell the story.
Sean was caught at 1 a.m. With the fire doors open to Eddie Grant's studio, taking the studio sofas number 1 and 2 and pushing them into a van to take down to town to sell for crack.
So I will actually tell you that word for word because it was very difficult. It said Sean was caught at 1 a.m. with the fire doors open to Eddie Grant's studio, taking the studio sofas number 1 and 2 and pushing them into a van to take into town to sell for crack. So now we're going to hear Tony say that again, so you can hear it again, but just notice what he adds to it, because you would think he would obviously be extremely angry. He's paying for this. He's essentially losing money. His record label is going under because they are not creating the album. They're spending all of his money. So listen to what he says. We'll hear the story again, and he adds just one comment at the end.
Sean was caught at 1 a.m. With the fire doors open to Eddie Grant's studio, taking the studio sofas number 1 and 2 and pushing them into a van to take down to town to sell for crack. I just think it's wonderful.
I just think it's wonderful. Again, it's just unbelievable how, you know, people say like, oh, I don't care about money, but they do. But with Tony Wilson, I genuinely believe anyway that he actually didn't. He was just more interested in the history he's making. So, for example, I'm making a podcast about this like 25 years later. I mean, I'm sure this wasn't Tony Wilson's motivation for thinking, I hope I'm on Martin Johnston's podcast. But the fact is, people still talk about this because of how absurd it was, how crazy it was, the crazy situation that it was. Situationism again. But here is a member from the band telling his version of that story of stealing the sofas and why they stole the sofas.
There was gifts, there was gifts to the dealers. There's a nice chair. When you're living in a crack house, they didn't have chairs.
So he said they was gifts Obviously, it should be they were, but he said they was gifts. They were gifts to the dealers because, when you're living in a crack house, they didn't have chairs.
There was gifts, there was gifts to the dealers. There's a nice chair. When you're living in a crack house, they didn't have chairs.
Now, I am not condoning the use of drugs. However, I am bringing attention to the fact that Tony Wilson actually lost his record label because of this. They couldn't survive without any more money again. The Happy Mondays didn't make the album. So Tony Wilson lost lots of money and the record label went under. But as we heard, as he said in an interview years later, I just think it's wonderful. Okay, so Tony Wilson also said, I wanted to get him actually saying this, but I couldn't find it. He said, the contract, we own nothing, musicians own everything, stopped us from making money. Fuck it. All that was valuable was the history we made, not the money we made, which, again, I just think is absolutely wonderful. This is why I have a photo of him in my house, because I don't know, when I found all of this out when I was in my sort of early 20s, and it had a big impact on my life. And sort of when I found this out, which was like around 2006-07, that was actually when Tony Wilson died. Okay, he died in 2007 of cancer, and there was a treatment he could have had to keep him alive a bit longer. However, the treatment cost £3,500 a month. And as we know, Tony Wilson didn't have much money because obviously we've spoken about he was losing 50 grand a month, all of this. And this is a quote, again, I have from him, which is, when they said I would have to pay £3,500 for the drugs each month, I thought, where am I going to find the money? I'm the one person in this industry who famously has never made any money. I used to say some people make money and some make history, which is very funny until you find you can't afford to keep yourself alive. I've never paid for private healthcare because I'm a socialist. Now I find you can get your tummy tucks and cosmetic surgery on the NHS, but not the drugs I need to stay alive. It's a scandal. And then sadly, he did pass away in 2007, in August, I remember it was, because in August 2007, I saw the Happy Mondays, and I remember they dedicated one of the songs to Tony Ryder, who had literally just died. However, to finish this podcast on a kind of happier note, I did promise you a story about me and someone connected to this. So in probably 2008 or maybe 2009, I went to a 90s night in Islington in London with Boom Boom Cannon, and Bez from the Happy Mondays was there. And I remember I had a bet with one of my friends. I don't really know why this happened. I think it was even just paper, rock, scissors. I can't remember. And the loser had to get on stage. Okay. So I lost the bet and I climbed over this fence, fell quite heavily onto the floor, got onto the stage, and Bez was dancing on the stage. And a security man came over to sort of, probably arrest me. But Bez literally stopped the security man, put his arm around me, and then Bez and I were dancing on the stage. It was absolutely mad. Unfortunately, it was kind of before smartphones, so no one actually had a smartphone, so there are no videos of this. However, ask Boom Boom, because it happened. And another strange thing about that is climbing over that fence and falling down onto the floor. I cut myself quite badly. I didn't really notice at the time because obviously maybe I had a drink or two, and I still have a scar on my right leg from that night. Okay, so a memory from that night. That's how maybe I'm connected to Tony Wilson, because Tony Wilson obviously spent some time with Bez. Okay, so I feel that I have connected to Tony Wilson in some way after my evening with Bez from the Happy Mondays. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this story about Manchester music, Tony Wilson, and also maybe even learned something about situationism and what I believe is the rock and roll spirit, okay? That punk spirit, the rock and roll English spirit, okay? So thanks a lot for listening. I will talk to you very soon. But in the meantime, just keep on rocking.
Thanks so much for listening to Rock and Roll English. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit rockandrollenglish.com and facebook.com/rockandrollenglish. We'll catch you next time.